Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm here with Dr. Gerard Saucier. He is a professor of psychology at the University of Oregon. He won the 1999 Cattell Early Career Research Award from the Society of Multivariate Experimental Psychology. His research focuses on personality psychology, values, cultural psychology, moral psychology, and political psychology. Dr. Saucier has been a leader in developing and refining dimensional models for personality, including the Big Five, and upgrading from the Big Five to a more comprehensive Big Six model and a broader, more universal Big Two. And those are precisely the topics that we're going to cover today. So, Dr. Saucier, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Okay, so the first thing I would like to ask you is, let's start off by really putting into perspective the historical and scientific importance of the Big Five, because I guess that really comparing to other approaches that we had before in terms of personality psychology, perhaps some of them that were put forth by individual psychologists, this really changed the paradigm quite a bit, right?
Yes, it did. Prior to the popularity of the Big Five, we had numerous competing models by various experts or theorists, and there was a kind of a lack of consensus on which set of characteristics we could use to organize the research. Another problem was that for the most part, these theorists were selling inventories commercially, so that researchers had to pay, had to have a budget in order to, it actually was creating a lot of impediments. And so when the Big Five came along, I think there was a lot of hunger for an agreed set of personality dimensions that researchers could focus on and kind of pool their results around this kind of method. So yeah, that's sort of the historical context. Really importantly, in the 1980s into the early 1990s, that was the context out of which it came.
Okay, but what was the methodology used to arrive at the Big Five? Because I've already talked with Dr. Louis Goldberg, who was really one of the pioneers in terms of this research, and he told me about the lexical hypothesis. But could you also explain that to us here?
It's really the confluence of a couple of things. There were studies that found results like the Big Five without the lexical hypothesis, but it was really the lexical approach that gave it a lot of its kind of compelling quality. So, what is called the lexical hypothesis? Well, I kind of state it a little different. I call it a lexical rationale. But I think with the way people usually understand the hypothesis is that the most important attributes in real-world social transactions will be encoded or represented in the language. Therefore, you can find out what the most important personality attributes are by studying the language. I think that's the way it's usually stated. I would usually state it more as that the degree of representation that attributes have in language, that traits have in language, corresponds somewhat to the general importance of the attribute. So the more it's represented in language, the more likely it is to be important in real-world transactions. That's just a slight change, shift there, but it's actually more the way that I would understand it. In order to think about, evaluate the lexical hypothesis, you have to think about what's the alternative hypothesis. Well, what's another possibility? Well, another possibility is that we have all this language for talking about personality, but it's kind of useless. In other words, people talk about all this stuff, but it's just superficial, has no meaning. It's not a good guide to the real personality differences. So that if that's the case, you'd actually need to go to experts to tell you what were the important things about personality. That's actually not a way out view. That corresponds a little bit with how people view psychoanalysts, that You're not going to figure out your problems yourself. You need to go to an analyst in order to figure it out. Same kind of idea. And in the 1990s, Jack Block, there was a kind of an exchange in a major journal between Goldberg and I and Jack Block about this, that Block was arguing actually that you couldn't rely on the judgments of everyday people for distinguishing important attributes of personality because they'd be missing too many things. They were too naive. Mm-hmm. So that's really, that expert view is more or less the alternative. And so I think it was I think we had a little bit too much of the expert views before. There were all these experts, they were competing with each other, and we didn't really have common ground. So that's one side of it, is the lexical hypothesis. The other is a statistical technique called factor analysis that takes a large number. It's basically called a variable redundancy technique, or reduces the number of variables. So, we have thousands of terms used to describe personality. How do you reduce those down to just a few basic dimensions? Well, this is a statistical technique that's built to do that. It basically analyzes the correlations among all these terms in real data, and then figures out what are basically the underlying dimensions that are causing most of the correlations. So you put those two together, you have people isolating the terms in the dictionary that refer to personality, especially the most frequently used ones, and then turning that set of terms into a questionnaire, long questionnaire, lots of variables. Then you reduce the number of variables down to a few basic dimensions using factor analysis. Mm-hmm. That's about as short as I can make it. Yeah.
Okay, very well. Okay, so according to the lexical hypothesis, the traits of personality that people would pay more attention to, they would be encoded in their languages, right? So does it have sort of a biological basis to it then, that is, people would be attuned to look for certain personality traits because those would be the more relevant to their interactions or something like that?
Well, it's possible that it would tend to reflect biological sources of variation, but it's also possible that it reflects cultural sources of variations. We are cultural creatures as much as we are biological creatures, and so I think you do wind up probably with a mixture there. So just to contrast that, consider studying animals using personality dimensions. Well, you can't go ask the animals. The animals don't have a language you can study. So people wind up, some people have actually imposed the big five on animals, and then looked at the dimensions and so on. Other people basically argue that you need to take more of a biological approach with that. But I guess the difference is that you kind of expect that the animals might not be aware of many of the major dimensions that distinguish their personalities. They don't talk about it all the time. We might expect that they could to some degree have some non-awareness. And probably there's a lot of ways in which humans vary that we're not really aware of, and that we need experts to point out to us. And I think biological theories are kind of useful for pointing us to that. But I think there's big pieces that we can gather just by looking at the language people use, and the words in that language, and what content is in the languages.
Mm-hmm. Yes, but here with the big five and also with the big six that we're going to talk about later in the interview, we're trying to arrive at human universals in personality psychology, right? That is, personality traits that occur in all cultures and all languages, right?
Okay. So we're trying to. I'm not convinced that either the Big Five or the Big Six accomplishes that goal, but that is certainly a goal. Yes.
Okay. So, and in what ways would you say language and culture can influence how people express themselves about personality traits?
Well, here's a curious fact. If you look at take the terms that we most commonly use to describe ourselves and other people and personality. If you have people judge how desirable or undesirable those characteristics are, you discover that you have a kind of a bimodal distribution. There's a lot of unfairly desirable ones, a lot of undesirable ones, and there's not very many that are neutral. So it's a curious kind of finding. Why is that? It's probably because I don't think there's been research to kind of delve into this enough, but it's probably because a good part of the function of personality language is to comment on other people's behavior and our own to some degree in a way that has to do with cultural norms. Mm-hmm. So see, the desirability of attributes is something that we learn when we learn the language. We learn, for example, that being maybe cruel is a bad thing and to be generous is a good thing. And we're really learning a culture. We're learning to some degree a personality assessment system, but it's also a kind of a socially normative system. And so when we use personality language, we're actually in some ways exercising this inherent, these inherent cultural norms that are built into the personality language itself. So that's a key way that it winds up impacting it. So what that means is if you go to a different culture where the norms are a little different, that can start having a little bit of an impact on how the personality terms are used and how they wind up being structured when you do these analyses.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay, so could you now tell us about the Big Six, how it differs from the Big Five, and perhaps go through each of the 6 traits that are considered there?
I would say that the Big Six is actually just a slight variation on the Big Five that adds one additional dimension of variation. The major addition is that there's a factor that's labeled honesty. I have to note that there's 2 different kind of representations of the Big Six. The better known one, in fact, is the HEXACO dimensions. Mm-hmm. It's better known because it actually came out a little earlier and has a more widely used questionnaire. The Big Six, actually, that label is what I applied in 2009 to a structure that I found across a lot of these studies of language, of the lexicon in different languages. But both of those models share a same basic structure, and they both have an honesty factor of some kind. It's just that in the HEXACO model, it's called honesty and humility, and in the Big Six model, it's called honesty and propriety. Social propriety, it's just a slight difference in orientation there. Other than that, it's like the Big Five, except for some small variations in that agreeableness is actually, if you look at different Big Five measures, they vary quite a bit on exactly what agreeableness is. And the Big Six model is actually much more consistent about that. It basically identifies agreeableness as having to do with patience versus antagonism and bad temper, and it's quite consistent about that. And the other thing that's different is that, at least particularly in the HEXACO model, the emotional stability or neuroticism factor is labeled emotionality, and it's a little slightly different. But other than that, it's pretty much the Big Five plus 1.
Mm-hmm. And how did you arrive at these different approaches to some of the traits that we already had, like agreeableness, as you said, and also the inclusion of an extra dimension or trait as is honesty/propriety?
Well, they're arrived at because in order to arrive at the Big Five, you simply specify in your analyses that you're going to have 5 factors. And in order to arrive at the Big Six, you specify that there are 6 factors. So it's as simple as that. That's a kind of an arbitrary setting when you run the analysis, how many factors you're going to select. And if you allow 6 factors, at least in many of the languages we study, you tend to get this pattern that includes an honesty factor. And when you run it with 5 factors, very frequently you don't. That's the difference.
Okay, so it was just one dimension that you found in occurring in several languages that was
Okay,
not
right. Yeah.
accounted for by
So,
the Big Five?
so the exact, exact history here would be that uh, Ashton and Lee had done a study of the language of personality in the Korean language, and they found something like the Big Five, but they also found that if they allowed 6 factors, they got a very interesting, highly interpretable dimension that they labeled as honesty. And around that time, they were also doing a lexical study in French using a French-Canadian sample, and they got a similar kind of result. So they found this to be probably more than a coincidence, and so they said they went and studied more languages and identified some regularities in 6-factor results that go beyond what's in the 5-factor results. Now, the way I came onto that, around the time they were doing these studies in Korean and French, at the time I was more interested in 7-factor models because I had seen a really interesting structure from a Filipino language study, and I had noticed some similarities in some other languages. And so I was kind of exploring whether you could develop a consistent 7-factor representation. But ultimately, when I put all the languages together and compared them, I found that these 2 of those 7 factors tended to combine very frequently. And so that's how I got the Big 6. The difference between the language of personality origins is that HEXACO is based only on studies where they focused on personality trait descriptors narrowly understood. And I also included a number of studies where they had much wider set of variables, more evaluative terms, more emotional state terms, and so on. And so I actually based the Big 6 on somewhat more studies than the HEXACO did. But otherwise, those are actually very similar models, interchangeable.
Okay, and could you tell us now about the big 2 inventory that includes social self-regulation and dynamism? Because I wanted to ask you if these are 2 completely distinct personality traits from the Big 5 or the Big 6, or if they are somewhat related to them.
No, they're not distinct. And by the way, there is no Big 2 inventory.
Okay.
I've been asked if there's a measure of this, but there have been some issues with how you measure something so broad well enough, and that hasn't been a real priority. I don't think anybody actually has a Big 2 inventory. So the Big 2 is simply what you get if instead of plugging in 5 or 6 factors to your analysis, you say, I just want 2. It's what you get. I'll say. So it's as simple as that. It's what you get when you allow just 2 factors. In fact, those factors are pretty big. They tend to be pretty big. So they cover almost half as much variance as the Big 5 does. Approximately half, actually. I got interested in the Big 2 because I was interested in comparing the studies of language of the personality lexicon in different languages, and interested in what would correspond between one language and another. And I found actually there was a lot of differences between languages. But if you looked only at the 2-factor level, there's a great deal of similarity. You can take virtually any language anywhere and they generate the same dimension. So to me, that is what is universal, not the Big 5. The Big 5 actually varies quite a bit more between language contexts if you're talking about what the language just spontaneously produces on its own. Okay? The Big 2 just does spontaneously get produced in every language that we've looked at so far. So this is actually more universal. That criteria, I have to point out, is different than the one that's often used, like Costa and McRae with their 5-factor measures. What they do is they claim cross-cultural universality based on the fact that they take their measure, translate it into another language, and it still kind of functions pretty well. And then they say that means it's universal. Well, I don't think that's a very strong claim because we don't know that many other inventories with different numbers of factors or structures couldn't do the same thing. I'm talking here about a criterion. What does the language itself produce independent of you translating some Western model into the. And so one of the results of that is you can say that the Big Two is not a culturally biased model. Very hard to argue there's any cultural bias in that. You can argue the Big Five is culturally biased because the places where it's been found most clearly are the languages that are originated in Northern Europe. You get away from those languages, it gets weaker. Big Six, HEXACO does a little bit better on that, but it does appear that when you go pretty far away from Western cultures, that model also has problems. The Big Two is universal. So in an earlier stage, I'm kind of on a different track now, but I was focused a great deal on replicability. What would be a way of understanding personality variation that you could go to any culture and it work perfectly well everywhere, work the same in every place? And that's where if you pursue that criterion, I think you wind up with the Big Two. Mm-hmm. But now I've actually gotten more interested in prediction. The problem with the Big Two is that if you're only measuring two things, you're not able to predict things very well. So the Big Five predicts things much better than the Big Two. And I've gotten more interested in models that predict better than the Big Five and the Big Six. So a lot of our recent research has been in that direction.
Mm-hmm. So the strengths and the weaknesses of each of these models, the Big Five, the Big Six, and the Big Two, have to do with the goals that we have, that is in terms of us seeking for universality or higher predictive ability, capacity, and things like that?
Universality and higher prediction tend to be at cross purposes. It's hard to do both.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So that's just the way that it is in this particular domain, at least.
Mm-hmm. And is there a sort of a general trend or a general goal that you would like to get at with any of these models or inventories? That is, what would be the end goal of trying to create a sort of universal inventory of personality traits in humans?
Well, psychology is basically an attempt to understand the mind and behavior of humans everywhere, not just in one particular cultural site. So the part of it is just understanding the ways in which people vary that arise in any particular culture setting. That's a really important finding for psychology in general, for personality, even for cultural psychology, for science in general. So that would be one kind of goal. That would be one reason why you'd want universality. Another reason why you might want universality is to minimize bias. You don't really want your measures to be ethnocentric, to be biased toward one type of culture and basically using, for example, a Western cultural lens and imposing that on all other populations around the world. That's likely to lead. Well, one thing that's going to happen is that the validity of the assessment is going to go down as you go to non-Western contexts. Then, so it'd be better to have a model that was developed in what I call a culturally decentered model way. That you derive the model based on data from multiple, very diverse cultural contexts, and then you're more guaranteed that it's not going to be biased and it's going to generalize better. So that's I think the ultimate goal with universality. It's partly just the understanding what's common, something common about human psychology, and minimizing bias. You want another possible goal there is a comprehensiveness, that you want to have to capture as many distinctions as possible that are important and are likely to be in the language. So this is a limitation, particularly of Big Two. It only captures two major kinds of distinctions, very big, important ones, but there's only two. The Big Five does a little better, but it's still quite limited. To be more comprehensive, you might need to go to a lot more dimensions than that. And then another goal would be to be able to predict behavior based on personality assessments. Important outcomes having to do, say, with health, or perhaps psychopathology, or having to do with work outcomes or things like this. Personality measures are already used for that purpose. And probably being more comprehensive, you would expect that a more comprehensive measure with more independent sources of variation would predict better. So that's why I say I don't advocate for using the big two as a predictor model, because it's really focused only on the common denominators, and it's not likely to be the best prediction system.
And would another goal be to completely capture the entirety of human psychological traits and also of human personality variance? I mean, is that the case, that what you and other people as well, of course, are trying to arrive here is to try to have a complete picture of human personality, or just of the traits that are more important according to certain criteria?
I think it may be impossible to be complete about that. There's just too many potential distinctions and variables that could be small, perhaps trivial, but there's lots of things going on. I think it's just a matter of getting the most important ones and having enough so that you're able to predict well. So, in terms of how many dimensions that means you should use, well, we haven't really tested the upper limits of that yet. We don't know whether, for example, recent work we've done is indicating that you can predict a lot better with 20 dimensions, say, than with 5 or 6. But we don't really know how far up you need to go in the number of dimensions before the gains in prediction becomes too small. But definitely, we can definitely use more than 5 or 6.
And when you're talking about prediction here, what exactly are you referring to in terms of human behavior?
Let's see. How about if you could predict what people's, based on their personality, what their health was likely to be like in 10 or 20 years? Would that be important?
Sure.
How about the possibility that their personality might predict how long their life would be? Might that be important? How about if personality would predict how well they would do at jobs in general, or at particular kinds of jobs? Would that be important? That's the sort of thing that practical kinds of outcomes that we focus on. Can it predict how well they would do in school? You know, their grades in school. You might think that would be entirely a function of cognitive abilities, but of course it has to do also with how well organized and hardworking people are, and other kinds of factors. So, you know, there's a variety of different outcomes like that would be important to predict.
Yes, that's the difference, for example, between IQ and what it predicts, and the predictions that we get from a score in, for example, conscientiousness.
Yes,
right?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Okay. And in terms of the subcomponents that were added to the Big Five, the 10 aspects that I think were developed, if I'm not mistaken here, by Colin DeYoung and colleagues, do you think that those 10 aspects that broke down each of the 5 traits into 2 different aspects, that they somewhat improved the Big Five in terms of predictive ability or universality, or in any other area?
I don't know about universality, because that's a very useful system, but it was actually developed based entirely on data from the United States. So I do think it would improve prediction. I can't say that it would do anything to improve universality. I think Colin DeYoung himself has been finding that it's breaking down the Big Five into these 2 aspects for each of the dimensions actually helps if you're relating it to neuroscience distinctions. So that could be a useful avenue. It should basically help predict things better, but I don't think it would help necessarily with universality. like I said before, it tends to be the case that as you add more distinctions and dimensions, you get less correspondence between languages and cultures.
Mhm. And when you refer there to neuroscience, were you saying that perhaps the 10 aspects allow for us to better understand what are the areas of the brain that are related to processing information that is associated with each of the 10 aspects? Is that it?
Yes, areas, circuits in the brain, or the volume of different parts of the brain. Any of those could be relevant. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and is any of these inventories, the Big Five, the Big Six, the HEXACO, and so on, already used in clinical psychology or any sort of clinical practices?
Yes. Increasingly, I think the Big Five has started to have a lot of influence in clinical circles. In fact, I'm aware that there's a prominent manual that's used for diagnoses of psychopathology, the DSM, and there was a lot of consideration of whether they should incorporate the Big Five factors within those kinds of diagnoses. I don't think it ultimately got built in at the last revision. But the Big Five is actually used increasingly in clinical work. The advantage of HEXACO or Big Six would be that that honesty dimension would tend to capture certain kinds of disorder tendencies a little better, particularly antisocial disorder and narcissism, which tend to correspond to low end of honesty, humility, or propriety. So there should be a little bit of an advantage there, but I don't think HEXACO has had such a big imprint, or the Big Six, on clinical areas yet.
And
one of the things we actually showed with the in our Big Two work was that a prominent distinction in psychopathology is between internalizing and externalizing disorder tendencies. Internalizing ones have to do with depression and anxiety. It's like problems that people, you know it's a problem because you feel it in yourself. It's more subjective. Externalizing problems have more to do with you become a problem for other people through your impulsivity or your being annoying or violent or substance abuse, things like this. And the Big Two actually do correspond somewhat to those two basic distinctions. But I don't think that's been developed very much in the literature.
And do you think that any of these inventories could be used primarily to deal with psychopathology, or perhaps also to help people make certain kinds of life decisions? Like, for example, if I know my scores in terms of the Big Five or the Big Six, perhaps some professional could help me build a trajectory in terms of occupation or something like that?
Yes. In fact, that kind of angle has been developed a lot by Robert Hogan, who's has a personality inventory that has some correspondence with the Big Five, and he actually, as well as having these basic kinds of Big Five-like scales, he has scales for different occupational areas and what would make you do well in those areas. That's just as an example, he has one of his scales, I believe, is called something like sales orientation. Another was like customer orientation. Those are two different kinds of skills: being able to sell things, being able to interact well with customers, not necessarily the same thing. And those are partly based on personality distinctions.
And does it matter here when we're analyzing perhaps how these traits get associated with certain aspects of psychopathology or how people make life decisions and so on, if they are primarily innate or also influenced by life experiences or culture? Does it matter here, those aspects?
Well, I'm a little careful about using the word innate because it implies something biological, and humans are cultural creatures. So a lot of what is very natural to us and just is going to be inevitably occurring is actually due to culture and not to biology. And you also have to recognize that even though personality characteristics are pretty stable, they're not perfectly stable. So people do change. There's actually some predictable patterns in how people change across the lifespan in these traits. And the consistency of who, say, is the most extroverted or the most agreeable at one time point, it doesn't correspond perfectly with the same thing 10 or 20 years later. So there is some change with these dimensions. So it can also be understood in terms of personality change as well as just treating it like it's telling you what you are innately like. I mean, it tells you what you tend to be like, but I wouldn't go so far as to say that it's deterministic.
Mm-hmm. Yes, they are not deterministic from a biological perspective, but all of them are heritable, right?
Yes, but one of the Eric Turkheimer has proposed 3 laws of behavioral genetics, and one of them is everything's heritable. You can basically take any certainly psychological variable. If you run a study with the right twin design, you'll discover there's some heritability. That's not much. It doesn't mean very much anymore to establish that something's heritable.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So just one last question, and since we've been talking about culture and cultural variation and how culture might influence all of these aspects, and also perhaps the fact that the big 5 perhaps are more specific to North America or even the Western societies, and perhaps we have a weird effect here, right? But perhaps 2 big dimensions that vary cross-culturally are the individualistic or collectivistic one. Perhaps in the West, we tend to associate the West with individualism, and perhaps Eastern Asia and countries like that with collectivism. So in terms of personality traits, do we know anything about how these 2 big cultural aspects might influence them, or at least the ways by which people express their personality under the influence of these 2 big cultural trends?
Okay, so it has been argued that in more collectivistic societies, there's less of a expectation of consistency in people's behavior, so therefore it may be that actually personality is just marginally less important. Still important, but maybe a little bit less important. However, I want to actually question the assumption in that kind of question, which is that somehow individualism, collectivism are the basic way we distinguish cultures. Mm-hmm. This has to do with the work I do on the cultural psychology side. We actually don't have ways of measuring individualism, collectivism that show really large cross-cultural differences. The reason is that actually within societies there are individualists, people who are very individualistic and others who are not. And so the degree to which societies differ in that actually gets dwarfed by the degree to which that varies within societies. So we've been interested in what kinds of variables might show bigger cross-cultural differences than individualism and collectivism using questionnaire measures. And I can just mention 3 that actually show bigger effects than individualism and collectivism. The countries actually differ more on these. One of them is religiousness, just religious devoutness, religious behavior. Secondly, ethno-nationalism of some kind, where you're kind of basing your nationalistic sentiments on the notion that there's something special about your people. This actually varies a good bit between societies. And third, kind of belief in the importance of families being run by men rather than equally. That actually has a bigger difference between cultures right now, at least, than individualism, collectivism measures do.
Mm-hmm. And in what ways do those aspects influence personality traits?
Well, you could argue that they are personality traits.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so how do you define a personality trait? Okay, so a consensual, widely used kind of definition would be that it's stable patterns of behavior, emotion, and thinking. Okay, so these are basically just thinking patterns. They actually show stability across time. So you could argue that they are just like thinking pattern aspects of personality. So, if I'm religious, chances are, if I'm religious now, 10 years from now, I'm going to be fairly religious too. It's actually a quite stable tendency. So how is that not a personality dimension in itself? So we have to. You can ask. There has been research looking at how religiousness, for example, is related to personality, and it generally shows some relatively small but consistent relations with agreeableness and conscientiousness. But I would argue, actually, that it's worth considering that the tendency to believe in and rely on supernatural powers or not is itself a personality difference.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so going back to my original question and now perhaps reformulating it a bit, do we know of any aspects of culture that influence how people express their personality traits?
I don't think I'm not convinced that we have really firm evidence about that in any particular way. I can give you an anecdote, though, that's interesting. Okay, so we tend to assume in the West that somehow extroversion, introversion is a very important personality dimensions. When we gathered descriptors from languages in Africa, where we were consulting people who lived in villages, not in cities, one of the things that kind of stood out was that they didn't tend to use as many extroversion-related terms as people in the West did. And in fact, if you run one of these studies and you do a factor analysis, the extroversion factor is very weak. It's actually quite small. So what's going on there? Well, okay, so if you actually look at the way that extroversion is measured, it's often measured by inquiring about how people behave when they're around strangers, or when they're at public events, or if they're asked to do public speaking, they're at a party, and all. These are actually fairly culturally specific, potentially, situations. So if you have a society where you don't meet a lot of strangers, there's not a lot of parties where you meet strangers, you're not asked to go out and do public speaking, why would extroversion, introversion be such a big deal? Mm-hmm. So there's a way in which the culture sets out a set of situations, and to some degree, personality dimensions may kind of rely on a particular situations being salient. You could argue that something like morality is more universal because you don't find a society where nobody's ever trying to cheat or take advantage of anybody or be selfish. That's always going to occur. But situations of having to deal with how much you have to deal with strangers or public speaking, that's actually going to vary a lot between from one culture to another. Mm-hmm. So there's a potential there for the cultural situation to impact what personality traits are important.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So Dr. Saucier, just before we go, would you like to tell people perhaps what are some of the best online resources if they want to get in touch with more of your work?
Okay, well, let's see. I have if you do a search with some kind of search engine, put my name in and psychology or Oregon, University of Oregon, I do have a page on, actually I have a set of pages on the university website where you can get download papers. So that's one kind of source. And that includes some things that are hard to get even if you're at an academic setting, some things, chapters and books and so on. I also, I am on Twitter actually. Some people use Twitter as a way to announce all of their professional activities. I confess I haven't done that as much as some other people do. I tend to use it more as a kind of a live journal about commenting on things that are coming up. But I am actually on Twitter, and you can sort of find me the same way, Gerard Saucier, Psychology. There's only one of me that's really on Twitter doing that. That's a couple of ways to do that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I will be leaving links to that in the description box of this video. And Dr. Saucier, again, thank you a lot for taking the time to be here with us today. It was really a pleasure.
Yeah, I enjoyed it. Thanks much.
Hi there, thank you for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've started my channel last year and I've been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. So to keep the channel sustainable, I would really like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there, or alternatively you can also do it on PayPal or Subscribestar. I will leave all the links in the description box. Otherwise, if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons Karen Litske, Anne Blanchett, Perelga Larson, Lau Guerrero, Chantel Gelinas, Jim Frank, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Brian Rivera, Lucas Stafiniak, and my first producer, Izar Webb. Thank you for